I was 26 when I learned that some silences have weight. If you're camping in the Appalachians right now, drop your campsite location in the comments. I want to know who else is out there tonight. I'd been planning the trip for 3 months. A solo weekend in the Cherokee National Forest, late September, when the crowds thin out and the ridgelines start to show their fall colors. I worked dispatch for a trucking company in Chattanooga, 12-hour shifts watching screens and answering calls, and I needed distance. Not from people exactly, from the constant noise of voices asking me questions I couldn't answer. The forecast called for clear skies. I should have known better. September in the Smokies is unpredictable, but I was already 2 hours down the highway with my pack in the passenger seat and a playlist I'd made specifically for the drive. I told myself a little rain wouldn't hurt. The trailhead was empty when I arrived around noon on a Friday. I signed the register, noted I'd be back Sunday morning, and started the 4-mile hike to a primitive site I'd found on a topographic map. It sat on a shelf of land between 2 ridges, tucked against a creek that ran clear most of the year. I'd never been there before, but the elevation lines looked gentle and the reviews on a hiking forum mentioned good tent sites and a stone fire ring someone had built years ago. The first drops came as I crossed the second ridge. Light at first, almost playful, tapping on the brim of my cap and darkening the shoulders of my pack. By the time I dropped into the hollow, it was steady. Not hard, just persistent. The kind of rain that finds every seam in your rain jacket and makes you wish you'd packed better. The campsite was exactly where the map said it would be. A flat bench of ground covered in old leaves, a fire ring built from creek stones, and the sound of water moving over rocks about 20 yards to my left. I set up my tent in 10 minutes, working fast with cold fingers, staking it tight because the wind was starting to pick up. The rain intensified as I crawled inside and changed into dry clothes. I cooked dinner under the vestibule, watching the forest darken through the mesh window. The creek got louder as the runoff built. The rain turned the canopy into a drumhead. I ate rice and dehydrated chicken, drank instant coffee from a titanium mug, and felt the day's tension start to dissolve. This was what I'd come for. The solitude, the simplicity, the absence of questions. I was asleep by 9. The sound woke me just after midnight. I know because I checked my watch, squinting at the faint glow of the dial in the absolute dark of the tent. At first, I thought it was part of the rain. A shift in rhythm, a change in the pattern of drops on the fly. But it wasn't. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the leaves outside my tent. Not the scurrying of a raccoon or the heavy shuffle of a bear. These were measured, heel to toe, the gait of something walking upright. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps circled the tent once, maybe 15 feet out, staying just beyond the perimeter I could clearly visualize. They moved with patience, with no urgency, as if whoever was walking had all the time in the world. I reached for my headlamp. My hand was shaking. I told myself it was another camper, someone who'd gotten lost in the rain and was looking for shelter. But the footsteps didn't come closer. They didn't call out. They just kept circling. I turned on the headlamp and unzipped the tent fly in one motion, sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing. The rain fell in silver needles through the light. The fire ring sat dark and empty. The trees swayed in the wind. But there was no one there. I kept the beam moving, scanning the tree line, the creek, the ground around the tent. My breath fogged in the cold air. The rain soaked through my sleeve where I'd pushed it outside the vestibule. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Bare footprints in the mud, circling my tent in a wide loop. Not boot prints, not shoe prints. Bare human feet, each toe distinct, the arch clearly defined, pressed deep into the soft ground. They formed a complete ring, unbroken, about 12 feet from my tent door. I counted them later in my head. There were over 40 visible prints in that circle, overlapping in places, as if the person had walked the same path multiple times. But here's what made my stomach drop. The prints only went in one direction, clockwise around my tent. There were no prints leading into the circle, no prints leading away. Whoever had walked that path had either appeared at the starting point or had been there long before I arrived, and they were either still standing somewhere in the dark beyond my light, or they had left by a method I couldn't see. I crawled back into the tent. I zipped the flies shut. I turned off the headlamp and sat in the dark with my knife in one hand and my bear spray in the other, listening to the rain and the creek and my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. The footsteps didn't return, but around 3 a.m. I heard something else. Humming. A low, tuneless hum, barely audible over the rain. It came from the direction of the creek, rising and falling in a slow rhythm that reminded me of a lullaby. It had no words, no melody I recognized, just that slow, patient hum threading through the white noise of the storm. It lasted maybe 5 minutes. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep again that night. At first light, I packed everything into my bag without eating breakfast. My hands were still shaking. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the sky was the color of old concrete. I walked to the edge of the clearing and looked at the footprints again, just to make sure I hadn't imagined them. They were still there, a perfect circle in the mud, toes pointed inward, facing my tent. I followed the tree line with my eyes, looking for any sign of where the person had come from or gone. That's when I noticed the tree. A hemlock, about 8 inches across, standing at the edge of the clearing on the side closest to the creek. At shoulder height, someone had stripped a band of bark away. The pale wood underneath was smooth and fresh, carved with something I couldn't quite make out from a distance. I walked over. Scratched into the exposed wood, crude but deliberate, were 3 words: "You stayed quiet." I hiked out in under 2 hours. I didn't stop to filter water. I didn't stop to adjust my pack. I followed the trail down the ridge, across the creek, and back to the parking lot where my car sat alone under the gray sky. I haven't been back to that site. I haven't been back to the Cherokee at all. But sometimes, late at night when the rain hits my apartment window in Chattanooga, I think about those footprints. I think about the humming, and I think about those 3 words carved into the tree. You stayed quiet, like it was a test, like I'd passed, like staying silent in the dark while something circled my tent was exactly what I was supposed to do. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd called out. My name is Rachel, and I need to tell you about the stones. If you've ever found something arranged in the woods that didn't belong, comment below. I need to know I'm not alone in this. I started hiking the Appalachian Trail in sections about 4 years ago. Not the whole thing, just pieces when I could get away from work. I'm a pediatric nurse in Asheville, and the shifts are long and the exhaustion is the kind that settles into your bones. The trail was my reset button, a way to remember what quiet felt like. In October of last year, I planned a 3-day trip along a stretch in North Carolina, just south of Hot Springs. The weather was supposed to be perfect. Cool mornings, clear skies, the leaves at peak color. I'd done this section before, knew the shelters, knew the water sources. It felt safe, familiar. I started Friday afternoon, hiking in about 6 miles before setting up camp at a site I'd used the year before. A small clearing on a ridge with a view to the west, just enough space for a tent and a tarp. No shelter nearby, no other campers. Just me and the forest, and the smell of wood smoke that always seems to hang in the air up there, even when there's no fire. The first night was perfect. I cooked pasta on my stove, watched the sunset paint the ridges orange and purple, and slept hard under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled salt across black cloth. Saturday morning, I packed up and hiked another 8 miles north, planning to camp at a different site before looping back on Sunday. The trail wound through oak and hickory forests, past streams running clear and cold, over rocky outcrops that required both hands to climb. I passed 2 other hikers going south, exchanged nods and brief hellos, and kept moving. The second campsite was one I'd never used before. I'd marked it on my map based on a recommendation from a trail forum. Someone had posted about it the previous spring, called it the quietest spot on this whole section. The description mentioned a flat area near a spring, good drainage, surrounded by old-growth hemlocks. I found it around 4 in the afternoon. The clearing was there, exactly as described. Flat ground, soft with years of hemlock needles, a spring trickling down the slope about 20 yards to the east. The trees formed a natural wall around the space, blocking the wind and most of the light. It felt sheltered, protected, and in the center of the clearing, arranged in a perfect circle about 10 feet across, were stones. Not a fire ring, not random rocks. These were river stones, smooth and round, each about the size of a grapefruit. They were spaced evenly, maybe 8 inches apart, forming a boundary that was too precise to be accidental. I counted them, 32 stones. I stood at the edge of the clearing and stared. My first thought was that someone had made a meditation circle or some kind of trail art. People do that sometimes, stack rocks or arrange things as a way of marking a moment. But something about this felt different. The stones were clean. No moss, no lichen, no dirt. They looked freshly placed, like someone had scrubbed them and positioned them that morning. And the ground inside the circle was different from the ground outside. Inside, the hemlock needles were darker, more compressed, as if something heavy had been sitting there for a long time. I walked around the circle slowly, studying it. There were no footprints in the clearing except my own. No tent marks, no fire scar, no trash. Just the stones and the dark circle of ground they enclosed. I should have left. Every instinct I had told me to turn around, hike back to the previous site, and camp there instead. But the sun was already dropping behind the ridge. I had maybe an hour of good light left, and the nearest alternative site was 4 miles back the way I'd come. I set up my tent outside the circle, about 15 feet away, on the western edge of the clearing. I told myself the stones were harmless, someone's art project, a quirky trail marker. Nothing to worry about. I ate dinner as the light faded. The forest settled into that particular stillness that comes right before dark, when the daybirds have gone quiet and the night sounds haven't started yet. I crawled into my tent, zipped the flies shut, and read by headlamp for an hour before turning off the light. I fell asleep around 9. The scraping woke me, a slow, grinding sound, stone against stone, rhythmic and deliberate. I opened my eyes in the dark and listened. The sound was coming from outside the tent, somewhere close. It would scrape for 3 or 4 seconds, then stop, then start again. I turned on my headlamp and checked my watch. It was just after midnight. The scraping continued. I unzipped the tent window and aimed the beam outside. The stones had moved. They were no longer in a circle. They'd been rearranged into a line, a straight line that started at the edge of the clearing near the spring and ended about 3 feet from my tent door. 32 stones, evenly spaced, pointing directly at me. My hands went cold. I swept the headlamp across the clearing. There was no one there. The trees stood black and still. The spring trickled. The line of stones gleamed pale in the light. And as I watched, one of the stones at the far end of the line moved. It didn't roll. It slid. A smooth, deliberate movement across the hemlock needles, scraping as it went, repositioning itself about 6 inches closer to my tent. I watched it happen. I saw the stone move on its own, with no hand pushing it, no animal nudging it. It just slid forward and stopped. Then the next stone moved. Same sound, same smooth slide. 6 inches closer. Then the next. They were moving one at a time, in sequence, each stone shifting forward in a slow, patient progression. The line was crawling toward my tent like a living thing. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I sat frozen in my sleeping bag with the headlamp in one hand and my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat, watching the stones inch closer. The fourth stone moved, the fifth, the sixth. I turned off the headlamp. I don't know why. Some part of my brain decided that if I couldn't see it happening, maybe it would stop. Maybe the light was causing it. Maybe I was still asleep, and this was a dream that would end if I just closed my eyes. I sat in the dark and listened to the scraping, stone after stone moving forward, the sound getting closer with each shift. I could track their progress by ear. 10 feet away, 8 feet, 6. I reached for my pack and pulled out my bear spray. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it. I held it in front of me like a weapon, like it would do anything against stones that moved on their own. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. I sat in the dark, breathing through my mouth, waiting for the next scrape. It didn't come. I counted to 60, then to 60 again. The forest was completely still. I turned the headlamp back on and looked outside. The stones had stopped moving. They formed a line that ended exactly at the threshold of my tent, the final stone touching the edge of my ground cloth. 32 stones in perfect alignment, pointing at me like an arrow. And sitting on top of the last stone, balanced carefully, was something small and white. I stared at it for a long time before I reached out and picked it up. It was a tooth, a human molar, root intact, clean and dry, old from the yellowed color but not ancient. It felt light in my palm, fragile, like it might crumble if I squeezed. I dropped it. I didn't throw it. I just opened my hand and let it fall onto the ground outside my tent. Then I zipped the window shut, pulled my sleeping bag over my head, and sat in the dark with my bear spray in one hand and my knife in the other. I didn't sleep. I listened to the forest and waited for the scraping to start again. It didn't. When the sky began to lighten around 6, I looked outside. The stones were back in their original circle. 32 stones, evenly spaced, surrounding the dark patch of ground in the center of the clearing, as if they had never moved. The tooth was gone. I packed up in 15 minutes and hiked out, 10 miles back to the trailhead without stopping, without eating, without looking back. I reached my car by noon and drove straight home to Asheville. I reported it to the Trail Conservancy, told them about the stones, the movement, everything except the tooth because I knew how that would sound. The woman I spoke with listened politely and said they'd send someone to check the site. A week later, she called me back. She said they'd found the clearing and the stone circle. She said it looked like someone had built a memorial or a meditation space, and they dismantled it to discourage off-trail activity. I asked her if they'd found anything else, anything unusual. She said no, just the stones. I haven't hiked that section again. I haven't gone back to find out who built the circle or why, because part of me knows that whoever arranged those stones didn't leave them as art. They left them as a test, or a trap, or an invitation to something I don't want to understand. And sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I think about that line of stones crawling toward my tent. I think about the tooth balanced on the final stone, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed inside the circle instead of outside it. I wonder if the stones would have moved differently. They tell you the Appalachian Trail is crowded. They're wrong. Comment if you've ever felt watched in the mountains. I want to know how many of us there are. My brother convinced me to do the trip. I'd been going through a rough patch after my engagement ended, and Tyler thought a week in the woods would help clear my head. He'd done the Virginia section twice before, and knew the shelters, knew the rhythm of the trail. I trusted him. We started in early May, planning to hike about 70 miles over 6 days. The weather was mild, the trail was dry, and for the first 3 days, everything went exactly as Tyler had promised. We hiked 8 to 10 miles a day, stayed in shelters with other thru-hikers, swapped stories around small fires, and fell asleep to the sound of owls and distant coyotes. On day 4, we reached a shelter called the Cedar Knob Lean-To. I'd never heard Tyler mention it before, and it wasn't marked on my trail map. But as we climbed the last ridge of the day, Tyler pointed to a wooden sign nailed to a tree about 20 feet off the main trail. The sign was weathered, the letters barely visible, carved deep into the wood. Shelter 0.2 miles. Tyler said he'd stayed there on his first trip. He said it was quiet, off the main route, and hardly anyone used it anymore. He said it would be nice to have the place to ourselves for a change. We followed a narrow side trail that switchbacked down into a hollow. The forest thickened as we descended, the canopy closing overhead until the light turned green and dim. The air smelled like wet leaves and old wood. The lean-to sat at the bottom of the hollow, backed against a low cliff face. It was the old-style kind, 3 walls and a slanted roof, open to the front, with a sleeping platform raised about 2 feet off the ground. The structure was built from logs that had darkened with age, and the roof was covered in cedar shakes that were missing in patches. A fire ring sat about 10 feet from the opening, surrounded by several flat stones arranged as seats. Beyond the fire ring, the ground sloped down to a thin creek that gurgled over moss-covered rocks. The place looked abandoned. No gear, no trash, no sign that anyone had stayed there recently. But the sleeping platform was clean. Someone had swept it, or the wind had, because there were no leaves, no dirt, no debris. Tyler dropped his pack and smiled. He said we'd lucked out. We set up our sleeping bags on the platform, filtered water from the creek, and cooked dinner as the sun dropped behind the ridge. The hollow darkened fast. By the time we finished eating, the only light came from our headlamps and the small fire Tyler had built in the ring. We sat by the fire and talked about nothing important. Work, family, the miles we'd covered, the miles still ahead. Tyler seemed relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. He kept saying how good it felt to be back out here, away from screens and schedules and people who wanted things from him. I remember feeling grateful. Grateful for my brother, for the fire, for the quiet. Around 9, we put out the fire and crawled into our sleeping bags. The platform was hard but comfortable enough, and the sound of the creek was soothing. I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, like 2 people speaking just below the threshold of normal conversation. I couldn't make out words, just the rhythm of it, back and forth, question and answer, rising and falling. I opened my eyes. The shelter was dark. Tyler was asleep beside me, his breathing slow and even. The whispering continued. It was coming from outside the shelter, somewhere near the fire ring. I sat up slowly and reached for my headlamp. My hands found it on the platform beside my sleeping bag. I turned it on and aimed the beam toward the opening. The fire ring was empty. The stones sat dark and still. The creek murmured. The trees swayed slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel inside the shelter. But the whispering didn't stop. It moved. From the fire ring to the left, toward the creek. Then it shifted again, circling around to the right side of the shelter. The voices stayed low, stayed constant, always just out of reach. I shook Tyler awake. He jerked upright, blinking in the light of my headlamp. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He listened. His face changed. He heard it. We sat side by side on the platform, both of us silent, tracking the whispers as they circled the shelter. The sound never got closer than 20 feet, but it never moved farther away either. It just kept circling, patient and unhurried. Tyler grabbed his own headlamp and turned it on. We swept both beams across the clearing, into the trees, along the creek. Nothing. Just darkness and the faint shapes of trunks and branches. The whispering stopped. The silence rushed in so fast, it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Tyler and I looked at each other. His face was pale in the headlamp glow. "Animals?" I said. He shook his head. "That wasn't animals." We sat there for maybe 5 minutes, listening. The forest was completely still. No wind, no rustling, no insects. Even the creek seemed quieter. Then Tyler's headlamp flickered. It dimmed, brightened, dimmed again, then went out completely. "Batteries are new," he said. His voice was tight. My own headlamp began to flicker. I tapped it, shook it, but the light pulsed weakly and died. We were in total darkness. I've been in dark places before, caves, basements, rooms with no windows. But this was different. This darkness had texture. It pressed against my skin like something physical, something aware. Tyler's hand found my arm. His grip was hard enough to hurt. "Don't move," he whispered. I didn't ask why. I could feel it too, the sense that something was standing just outside the shelter. Not one thing, several things, standing in a loose circle around the opening, close enough to reach us if they wanted to. I heard breathing, not ours. This was deeper, slower, rhythmic and wet, like something drawing air through a damaged throat. Tyler's grip tightened. The breathing moved closer. I could hear footsteps now, soft and deliberate, moving across the dirt and leaves. They came to the edge of the platform and stopped. Something was standing right there, right at the opening. I could smell it. Damp earth and old sweat and something sour that made my stomach turn. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I sat frozen with Tyler's hand on my arm and the smell of whatever was standing 3 feet away filling my nose and my lungs. Then I felt it, a hand on my ankle. Cold fingers, thin and rough, wrapping around my bare skin where my pant leg had ridden up. The grip was firm but not violent. It just held me, the way you'd hold someone's arm to get their attention. I made a sound. Not a scream, just a choked gasp that caught in my throat. The hand let go. The breathing stopped. The footsteps retreated, moving away from the shelter in several directions at once. And just like that, the pressure lifted. The darkness felt normal again. Empty. Tyler fumbled with his headlamp. It turned on without issue, bright and steady. Mine did the same. We swept the beams across the clearing. Nothing. The fire ring, the creek, the trees, all exactly as they'd been before. But on the edge of the sleeping platform, right where I'd felt the hand, there was a wet print. 5 fingers, thin and elongated, pressed into the wood. The moisture was already evaporating, the print fading even as we looked at it. We didn't talk. We packed our bags in silence, stuffed our sleeping bags without rolling them, and shouldered our packs. It was maybe 3 in the morning, still hours before dawn, but neither of us suggested staying. We hiked out by headlamp. The side trail felt longer going up than it had coming down. Every shadow looked like a person. Every sound made us stop and listen. We reached the main trail and kept moving, hiking north through the dark, not stopping until the sky began to lighten, and we could see the trail clearly without our lights. We camped that night at a shelter 4 miles farther north. There were 3 other hikers there, and we stayed close to them, kept the conversation going, kept the fire burning until everyone went to sleep. Tyler and I never talked about what happened at Cedar Knob. Not that night, not on the rest of the hike, not in the 2 years since, but I looked it up when I got home. I searched online for Cedar Knob lean-to, for shelters in that area, for anything that matched the description. I couldn't find it. No maps, no trail guides, no forum posts, nothing. I called the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and asked about shelters near the section we'd hiked. The woman I spoke with listed 5 shelters in that area. None of them matched. None of them were called Cedar Knob. She asked me for the exact location. I gave her the coordinates from my GPS watch. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said there was no shelter at those coordinates. She said the trail didn't even pass through that hollow. I thanked her and hung up. Tyler still hikes. He sent me a picture last month from somewhere in Tennessee, smiling at the camera with a ridgeline behind him. He looked happy. But when I zoom in on the photo, I can see his eyes. And I know he's checking the tree line, looking for signs, looking for that weathered wooden marker pointing to a place that doesn't exist, looking for the lean-to that's still waiting in the hollow, cleaned and ready for the next people who follow the sign. I used to think fog was just water vapor. If you're reading this in the mountains right now, tell me in the comments. Tell me you're safe. I'm a wildlife photographer. I've spent the better part of 15 years chasing shots in places most people never see. Denali in February, the Everglades during mosquito season, the Boundary Waters in October when the ice starts to form. I'm comfortable with solitude. I'm comfortable with risk. What happened in the Pisgah National Forest last November changed that. I'd been hired by a conservation magazine to document black bears preparing for hibernation. The assignment was straightforward. Spend a week in the backcountry, get photographs of bears foraging in late autumn, capture the pre-winter behavior. I'd done similar work a dozen times before. I entered the forest on a Monday morning, hiking 8 miles into a drainage system known for high bear activity. The weather was cold, the sky overcast, and the forecast called for possible fog in the valleys overnight. Perfect conditions for the kind of moody, atmospheric shots editors love. I set up camp in a small clearing near a tributary stream. The site was unremarkable but functional. Flat ground, water access, decent sight lines for spotting wildlife. I hung my food bag properly, arranged my camera gear in the tent vestibule, and settled in for the evening. The first 2 days went well. I photographed 3 different bears, got close-ups of foraging behavior, captured a sow with 2 cubs stripping bark from a dead oak. The light was perfect, low and golden, filtering through the bare branches like honey. On Wednesday night, the fog rolled in. It came down the drainage around sunset, thick and white, moving like something alive. Within 30 minutes, visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. The forest disappeared. The trees became gray suggestions. The world contracted to just my tent and the small circle of ground I could see around it. I'd camped in fog before. It's disorienting, but not dangerous. You stay put, wait for it to lift, and avoid doing anything stupid like wandering off to pee and losing your bearings. I cooked dinner on my stove, ate inside the vestibule, and watched the fog press against the mesh like a living thing trying to get in. The temperature dropped. My breath fogged. I crawled into my sleeping bag around 8 and read by headlamp, listening to the absolute silence that fog brings. No wind, no birds, no rustling. Just the muffled nothingness of being wrapped in cloud. I turned off my headlamp around 10 and closed my eyes. That's when I heard the whistling. It was faint at first, a single note, high and clear, held for about 3 seconds before cutting off. Then silence. Then the note again, identical in pitch and duration. I opened my eyes and listened. The whistling came from somewhere outside the tent, out in the fog. It repeated every 10 seconds or so. Same note, same length, mechanical in its precision. I unzipped the tent window and looked out. The fog was so thick I could barely see the ground 5 feet away. The whistling continued, impossible to locate. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, reflected and distorted by the moisture in the air. I called out, "Hello?" The whistling stopped. I waited, listening to my own breathing and the faint drip of condensation from the trees. After maybe 2 minutes, the whistling started again. Same note, same rhythm, but closer. I grabbed my headlamp and turned it on, aiming the beam into the fog. The light didn't penetrate more than a few feet before scattering into a white glow. I swept it back and forth, looking for movement, for shapes, for anything. The beam caught something, A figure, standing maybe 15 feet from my tent, just at the edge of where the light dissolved into fog. It was the shape of a person, tall, thin, motionless. I couldn't make out details. No face, no clothing, just a dark silhouette against the white. My hand tightened on the headlamp. Who's there? The figure didn't move, didn't respond. The whistling came again. The same note, the same duration. But it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, aiming the light toward the back of the tent. Another figure, same height, same stillness, standing just outside the circle of light. My heart kicked against my ribs. I turned the beam to the left. Another figure. To the right. Another. They surrounded my tent. 4, maybe 5 silhouettes standing in the fog at equal distances, forming a loose circle around my campsite. None of them moved. None of them made a sound except for the whistling, which continued at regular intervals, coming from different directions each time. I turned off the headlamp. I don't know why. Panic, maybe, or some instinct that told me the light was making it worse, that seeing them was worse than not seeing them. I sat in the dark and listened to the whistling move around the tent. Front, left, back, right, front again. A slow rotation, like they were taking turns. The sound was patient, unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. I reached for my bear spray. My fingers found the canister and wrapped around it. The safety was still on. I didn't take it off. Bear spray wouldn't help against whatever was standing in the fog. The whistling stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No dripping water, no distant creak, nothing. The fog seemed to absorb every sound, leaving only the rush of blood in my ears. Then I heard breathing. Close. Right outside the tent wall to my left. Slow, deep inhalations and exhalations, like someone standing with their face inches from the fabric. I could hear the wetness in it, the slight rasp at the end of each breath. I didn't move. I sat frozen in my sleeping bag, with the bear spray in one hand and my other hand pressed over my mouth to keep my own breathing quiet. The breathing moved. It slid along the tent wall, from the left side to the front, to the right, circling slowly. Sometimes it stopped. Sometimes I'd hear a faint sound like fingers brushing against nylon. Then it would start again. This went on for hours. I know because I checked my watch every 10 minutes, watching the glowing numbers crawl forward with agonizing slowness. Midnight, 1, 2, 3. Around 4 in the morning, the breathing stopped. The fog began to thin. By 5, I could see the trees again. By 6, the first gray light of dawn filtered through the canopy. The fog lifted in patches, revealing the clearing, the stream, the normal morning forest. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground around my tent was soft with moisture. I walked the perimeter slowly, looking for footprints, for any sign that people had been standing there in the night. There were no prints. The ground was undisturbed except for my own tracks from the previous day. But there was something else. At 4 points around my tent, positioned exactly where I'd seen the silhouettes, someone had driven stakes into the ground. Thin wooden stakes, about 18 inches long, sharpened to points. Each one had a piece of white cloth tied to the top, hanging limp in the still air. They marked the corners of a square. My tent sat in the exact center. I pulled one of the stakes out of the ground and examined it. The wood was fresh, the cut clean. The cloth was cotton, old but not rotted, torn from something larger. There was writing on it in faded ink. I held it up to the light. It was a single word, written in careful script, boundary. All 4 pieces of cloth had the same word. I packed up in 20 minutes. I didn't take photographs of the stakes. I didn't mark the location. I just gathered my gear, shouldered my pack, and hiked out. 8 miles back to the trailhead, moving fast, not stopping to rest. The forest looked normal. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds called. A deer watched me pass from behind a laurel thicket. But every 50 yards or so, I'd see another stake. They lined the trail on both sides, not at the edge of the path, but set back about 10 feet into the forest, barely visible. Each one had a piece of white cloth tied to the top. I didn't stop to read them. I already knew what they said. I counted 37 stakes between my campsite and the trailhead. When I reached my truck, I threw my pack in the bed, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, staring at the empty parking lot, trying to process what had happened. Then I saw the map. It was tucked under my windshield wiper, a hand-drawn map on yellowed paper, creased and worn. It showed the drainage system I'd just hiked out of, the stream, the ridges, and in the center, marked with a small X, was my campsite. Around the X, someone had drawn a square. Written in the margin, in the same careful script as the cloth, "You camped inside. Next time, stay out." I never went back. I finished the assignment using photographs from the first 2 days and file shots from previous trips. The editor never knew the difference. I still work in the backcountry. I still camp alone. But I look for the stakes now. I look for markers, for boundaries I can't see, for squares drawn in the earth by hands I'll never know. And when the fog comes in thick and white, I pack up and leave. I don't wait for the whistling. I don't wait to see who's standing in the gray, because I know they're there. I know they're marking their territory. And I know that some boundaries aren't meant to keep us out. They're meant to keep something else in. My grandfather taught me to love the mountains. He never taught me to fear them. Drop a comment if you've ever broken a rule in the backcountry without knowing it. I need to hear your stories. I'm 43 years old, and I've been hiking the Appalachians since I was 8. My grandfather used to take me out every summer, just the two of us, walking trails that didn't always appear on maps. He knew the mountains the way some people know their neighborhood. Every ridge, every hollow, every spring. He died 6 years ago. Heart attack, quick and clean. At the funeral, my aunt handed me a leather journal she'd found in his desk. Inside were notes about trails, campsites, and hand-drawn maps of places he'd discovered over 50 years of wandering. On the last page, written in his careful handwriting, was a single line: "Never camp where the trail splits 3 ways. No explanation, no context. Just that one rule, underlined twice." I didn't understand it. I'd camped at trail junctions before, plenty of times. Nothing had ever happened. I assumed it was some old superstition, the kind of thing people believe when they spend too much time alone in the woods. Last April, I went looking for one of the campsites he'd marked in the journal, a place he called Ridgeback Spring, located somewhere in the Nantahala National Forest. The map was crude, but I'm good at reading topography, and I was confident I could find it. I drove down from Knoxville on a Thursday, parked at a trailhead near Waya Bald, and started hiking west. The trail was well maintained for the first 3 miles. Then it narrowed, and the blazes became sporadic. By mile 5, I was navigating by compass and instinct, following ridgelines and drainages that matched my grandfather's map. I found the spring around 2 in the afternoon. It bubbled out of a crack in a limestone shelf, forming a small pool before trickling downhill into a creek. The water was clear and cold. The site was perfect. Flat ground, good drainage, a natural windbreak from a stand of pines. And 20 feet from the spring, the trail split. Not 2 ways, 3. One path continued west along the ridge. One dropped down into a hollow to the south. One angled north, barely visible, overgrown with weeds and laurel. I stood at the junction and stared. My grandfather's words came back to me. Never camp where the trail splits 3 ways. I looked at the spring, at the clearing, at the perfect campsite. Then I looked at the 3 trails radiating out like spokes from a wheel. I should have left. I should have hiked another mile, found a different site, honored the one rule he'd bothered to write down. But I was tired. The site was ideal. And I told myself that rules made 50 years ago didn't apply anymore. The mountains had changed. The trails had changed. Whatever my grandfather had been afraid of was probably long gone. I set up my tent near the spring and cooked dinner as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. The evening was calm. No wind, no rain, just the quiet hum of the forest settling into night. I ate freeze-dried chili, drank coffee, and read by headlamp until my eyes got heavy. I fell asleep around 9. The voices woke me just after midnight. They were distant at first, coming from somewhere down the trail to the south. Multiple voices talking over each other, laughing, calling out. It sounded like a group of hikers, maybe a dozen people, moving through the forest in the dark. I sat up and listened. The voices got closer, louder. I could hear footsteps now, many feet crunching through leaves and snapping twigs. They were coming up the trail toward my campsite. I unzipped the tent window and looked out. My headlamp was in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I wanted to see them before they saw me. The voices reached the junction. The footsteps stopped. The talking continued, but it wasn't getting closer anymore. It was circling. The voices moved from the southern trail to the western trail, then to the northern trail, then back to the south. Around and around, never approaching the center where my tent sat, just endlessly looping through the 3 paths. I turned on my headlamp and aimed it toward the junction. There was no one there. The trails were empty. The voices continued, clear and distinct, laughing and calling out, but there were no bodies, no faces, no lights. I swept the beam across all 3 paths. Nothing. The voices stopped. The silence was instant and complete. No footsteps, no laughter, no distant conversation. Just the spring trickling and my own ragged breathing. I turned off the headlamp and sat in the dark, waiting. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then the footsteps started again. But this time they weren't on the trails. They were in the clearing, coming toward my tent from 3 different directions at once. I heard them approach from the south, from the west, from the north. 3 sets of footsteps, moving in unison, converging on the center where I sat frozen in my sleeping bag. They reached the tent and stopped. 1 at the front, 1 at the left side, 1 at the right. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I listened to the silence where the footsteps had stopped and felt the presence of 3 things standing just outside the thin nylon walls. Then they spoke, not to me, to each other. The voices were calm, conversational, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The words had a rhythm to them, a cadence that rose and fell like a song. They spoke for maybe 2 minutes, unhurried, taking turns. Then one of them touched the tent. A hand pressed against the fabric near my head, fingers splayed, pushing inward until the nylon bowed, and I could see the outline. 5 fingers, too long, too thin. Another hand pressed against the side, then another at the front. 3 hands pushing gently, testing the walls, feeling for the way in. I reached for my knife. My fingers closed around the handle. The blade was 4 inches long. It felt useless. The hands pulled away. The voices stopped. The presence lifted. As suddenly as it had arrived, I heard the footsteps retreat, moving away from the tent in 3 different directions. They reached the trails and kept going, fading into the distance. South, west, north. I sat in the dark and waited for dawn. When the sky began to lighten, I crawled out of the tent and looked at the ground. The dirt around my tent was soft, and in 3 places, directly where I'd felt the presence standing, there were impressions. Not footprints, just smooth, round depressions in the earth. each about a foot across, pressed deep into the ground as if something very heavy had been standing there. I packed up and started hiking out. I didn't follow any of the 3 trails. I cut straight through the forest, using my compass to navigate back to the main trail. It took me 3 hours of bushwhacking through laurel and over deadfall, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to walk down any of those paths. When I reached the trailhead, I sat in my truck and opened my grandfather's journal. I flipped through the pages, looking for anything else he'd written about Ridgeback Spring. On a page I'd missed before, tucked in the back, was a short entry dated 1987, camped at Ridgeback Spring. Heard voices on the 3 trails, saw shapes moving in the dark, left before dawn. The junction is old, older than the trails, older than the blazes. Whatever walks those paths has been walking them longer than we've been here. The spring is theirs. The clearing is theirs. Don't camp where the trail splits 3 ways. Beneath that, in fresher ink, dated just 2 months before he died. I went back. I had to know. The voices are still there. They're always there. Waiting at the junction, waiting for someone to camp in the center. I think they're looking for something, or someone. I don't know what they want. I'm glad I never found out. I closed the journal and drove home. I've been back to the Nantahala a dozen times since then. I've hiked past trail junctions, past 3-way splits, past places where the paths diverge and disappear into the trees. I never stop at those junctions. I never camp there. Because my grandfather was right. Some places in the mountains are old, older than the trails we walk, older than the names we give them. And the things that live in those places remember a time before we arrived. They're still waiting at the junctions, still walking the 3 paths, still pressing their hands against the tents of people who ignore the old rules. And sooner or later, one of those people won't leave at dawn.